Hey there, how's it going? Thanks for joining me today. Whether you're relaxing at home on your commute or winding down for the evening, I'm really glad you're here, because I've got to tell you about something absolutely extraordinary. Picture this moment with me. October 15th, 2021. A room full of world leaders sits in stunned silence as an announcement echoes through the United Nations Assembly. 15 countries have just pledged to protect half their territory forever, not in some distant future, starting now. I know what you're thinking. Half their territory? That sounds impossible, right? But here's the thing. This moment didn't come out of nowhere. This story really begins decades earlier. In the Amazonian dawn of 1978, Edward O. Wilson, and trust me, you're going to want to remember this name, stands at the edge of a burning forest. Smoke stings his eyes as he counts ant species that will be extinct by sunset. Can you imagine that? An entire lifetime of evolution, millions of years of adaptation, disappearing in the time it takes you to eat dinner. In that moment, watching an entire ecosystem collapse before his eyes, a radical thought takes hold in Wilson's mind. What if humanity's greatest achievement wasn't conquering nature, but knowing when to stop? Now. Wilson wasn't just any scientist standing there in the smoke. This was the guy who literally wrote the book on biodiversity. Actually, he wrote several books that completely changed how we understand life on Earth. He was watching something that would haunt him for decades, and that haunting, it would eventually reshape the entire planet. But here's where our story gets really wild. The transformation I'm about to tell you about isn't some future fantasy. It's already happening. Right now, as you're listening to my voice, there are places on Earth where this radical experiment is proving itself in the most unexpected ways. Take the Korean Demilitarized Zone. You know, that strip of land between North and South Korea where humans basically can't go because of all the landmines and military tension? Well, guess what's happened there over the past 70 years? It's become home to more biodiversity than anywhere else in temperate Asia. Why? Because humans stay out. Think about that for a second. The most militarized border on Earth has accidentally become one of our most successful conservation areas. Asiatic black bears, white-naped cranes, red-crowned cranes, the species that were disappearing everywhere else. They're thriving in this forbidden zone. And it's not just Korea. Remember Chernobyl, that nuclear disaster that forced everyone to evacuate in 1986? The exclusion zone around the reactor has become Europe's most incredible accidental wilderness. Wolves prowl through abandoned buildings. Lynx hunt in radioactive forests. Brown bears lumber down streets where children once played. I'm not saying radiation is good for wildlife. Definitely not. But what happened there proved something extraordinary. Nature doesn't need our help to heal. It needs our absence. These weren't planned experiments. Nobody said, "Hey, let's create a militarized zone and see what happens to the animals." Nobody said, "Let's have a nuclear accident and turn it into a nature preserve." But the results were so dramatic, so undeniable, that scientists around the world started paying attention. And Edward O. Wilson? He was paying attention too. All those years after standing in that burning Amazon forest, he started connecting the dots. If tiny strips of forbidden land could become biodiversity hotspots, what could we do if we actually tried? In 2016, Wilson published a book that would change everything. He called it Half Earth. The premise was simple and completely radical at the same time. To save life on Earth, including human life, we need to give half the planet back to nature. Half. The planet. When the book came out, a lot of people thought Wilson had lost his mind. Give up half of everything? Half our land? Half our oceans? How would we feed 10 billion people? Where would we live? Where would we grow our food? The questions came fast and furious, but Wilson had done the math. He'd spent his entire career studying how ecosystems work, how species survive, how biodiversity functions, and the numbers were clear. To prevent a mass extinction event, the sixth one in Earth's history, and the first caused by humans, we needed to protect at least 50% of the planet's land and oceans. Not 40%, not 45%. 50% was the minimum for keeping Earth's life support systems functioning. Now, here's where the story takes an incredible turn. Instead of dismissing Wilson as a crazy old scientist, something amazing started happening. People started listening, and more than that, they started acting. The Wyss Foundation, OCAA, we're talking serious money here, pledged $1 billion to the effort. 1 billion, with a B. They called it the Wyss Campaign for Nature, and their goal was to protect 30% of the planet by 2030. It was like a down payment on Wilson's 50% vision. But the real validation came from an unexpected source. The nation of Bhutan, Flea, you know, that tiny kingdom tucked between India and China? They were already protecting 70% of their land. 70%! And here's the kicker. They weren't just protecting it, they were thriving. Bhutan is the only carbon-negative country in the world. They absorb more carbon dioxide than they produce. Their prime minister stood up at international conferences and said, essentially, we've been doing this for decades. It works. What took you so long to figure it out? Then the indigenous communities started speaking up. From the Amazon to the Arctic, they said, we've been doing this for 10,000 years. Finally, you're listening. And that's when the movement caught fire. But here's what I need you to understand, and this is the part that blew my mind when I first learned about it. The Half-Earth movement isn't about creating empty wilderness. It's not about kicking humans out and putting up fences everywhere. It's about the most ambitious reorganization of human civilization ever attempted. Picture this. Vertical farms rising 30 stories high in Singapore, producing more food per square foot than traditional farming ever could. Entire cities volunteering to become denser, more efficient, so that the space between cities can return to nature. The great human consolidation that makes it all possible. In the Netherlands, and this is absolutely true, they've become the world's second largest food exporter, despite being smaller than West Virginia. How? By farming up instead of out. By using technology to do more with less space. Singapore has buildings that don't just have green roofs. They have entire ecosystems climbing up glass towers, trees and gardens and even small waterfalls integrated into the architecture. The city isn't fighting nature, it's partnering with it. And in London, they brought beavers back to urban waterways after 400 years. 400 years. Imagine telling someone in 1621 that beavers would be building dams in central London again in 2021. Each success story inspired 10 more cities to follow. It became a competition, in party, who could create the most innovative way to live with nature instead of against it. But the really incredible part is how fast this all happened. The Korean DMZ took 70 years to become a biodiversity hotspot by accident. The rewilding projects we're seeing now, they're showing results in 5 years, 10 years, sometimes even faster. In Mozambique's Gorongosa National Park, decimated by civil war, scientists discovered something amazing. When they brought back one species, 10 more returned on their own. Waterbuck came first, then lions showed up to hunt them, then wild dogs came to compete with the lions, then elephants returned to create the grasslands the waterbuck needed, then hippos came back to manage the waterways. It was like watching an ecosystem rebuild itself from memory. The wolves in Yellowstone did the same thing, but even more dramatically. 14 wolves, carried from Canada in 1995, stepped onto the snow. What happened next rewrote ecology textbooks. The wolves hunted elk. Makes sense, right? But here's the crazy part. The elk stopped browsing along riverbanks because they were afraid of being ambushed there. So trees exploded back to life along the rivers. The roots of those trees stabilized the riverbanks. The rivers, no longer eroding constantly, changed course and became more stable. Beavers returned after 70 years. Their dams created wetlands. The wetlands brought otters, muskrats, amphibians, songbirds. The entire ecosystem reorganized itself around the presence of one predator. 14 wolves had engineered an entire landscape. This became the template for rewilding projects around the world. Bring back the missing piece, and everything else follows. It was like finding the one loose thread that, when pulled, rewove the entire tapestry, and the technology to make this happen was advancing at breakneck speed. Satellite tracking revealed animal highways invisible to human eyes. Scientists discovered that an elephant in Kenya walks the exact same path her great-grandmother used, even though no elephant has traveled that route in 50 years. These ancient routes, encoded in genetic memory, became the blueprint for wildlife corridors. The Yellowstone to Yukon corridor now stretches 2,000 miles, reconnecting ecosystems that had been fragmented for a century. Bears in Montana can reach mates in Canada. Gene pools that had been isolated and weakening suddenly mixed and strengthened. But what really convinced people that this could work? The ocean experiments. When marine protected areas were created, some as large as Texas, the results were beyond anyone's wildest predictions. In the Philippines, a tiny protected area increased fish populations by 400% in 5 years. 400%. And here's the beautiful part. The fish didn't just stay in their protected area like good little fish. They spilled out into the surrounding waters, tripling the catches for local fishermen. The ocean needed just 3% protected to revitalize the other 97%. That's when everything clicked for policymakers. This wasn't about sacrifice. This was about investment. Protect a small area, and it pays dividends across a much larger area. The economic case started writing itself. New York City discovered that protecting its watershed saved $9 billion compared to building water filtration plants. $9 billion. Trees and soil did the job for free, and they did it better than any technology humans could build. Wetlands turned out to be worth $15,000 per acre per year in flood protection alone. Mangroves saved more coastline than seawalls at 1% of the cost. But here's what really got people excited: the health benefits. In Japan, doctors started prescribing forest bathing, spending time in wild spaces. Healthcare costs dropped measurably in areas with access to nature. Children with ADHD showed reduced symptoms after time in green spaces. The economic value of just the mental health improvements justified protection costs all by themselves. And then came the jobs. Ecological restoration started employing more people than coal mining. Indigenous guides became the highest-paid consultants as corporations sought their expertise. Conservation technology spawned entire industries: ASES, wildlife tracking, ecosystem monitoring, rewilding engineering. Former loggers became forest guardians, earning more money protecting trees than they ever made cutting them down. The half-Earth economy wasn't just sustainable, it was regenerative, each year building more wealth than the last. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when those 15 countries stood up at the United Nations in 2021. Costa Rica, Ecuador, Finland, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Chile, Colombia, Gabon, Kenya, Pakistan, Canada, the United Kingdom, France, and Germany. They didn't just pledge to protect half their territory, they committed to doing it together, as a coalition, because they'd realized something profound. The planet doesn't recognize national borders. An ecosystem in Canada connects to an ecosystem in Alaska. A migratory bird route goes from Argentina to the Arctic. Ocean currents flow from continent to continent. You can't rewild half the earth one country at a time. You have to think bigger. You have to think like the planet thinks. And sitting in that UN Assembly Hall, listening to those 15 countries commit to the most ambitious conservation project in human history, you could feel something shift. This wasn't just policy anymore. This was evolution. Homo sapiens, Aesir, the wise ape, was finally living up to its name. But this is just the beginning of our story, because making half-Earth actually work required solving problems nobody had ever solved before. It required technology that didn't exist. It required changing how humans think about their place in the world. And most importantly, it required figuring out how to make the other half of Earth work twice as hard to support 10 billion people. The revolution was just getting started. Now, you might be wondering, who are the people crazy enough to actually make this happen? Because let me tell you, the revolution had many parents, but the midwives were completely unexpected. Meet Christine Tompkins, former CEO of Patagonia, FI. You know, the outdoor clothing company. Most CEOs retire to golf, courses. Christine? She bought millions of acres in Chile and Argentina just to give them back. I'm talking about land purchases so massive they showed up on satellite images. Picture this scene. Christine sitting across from Chilean government officials who are looking at her like she's completely lost her mind. Here's this American businesswoman offering to donate land the size of Switzerland to create national parks, for free. No strings attached. The officials keep asking, "What's the catch?" And Christine keeps saying, "There is no catch. We want to give this to Chile forever." You have to understand the skepticism she faced. In South America, when foreign companies buy vast amounts of land, it's usually to extract something: timber, minerals, oil. The idea that someone would buy land just to protect it, that was revolutionary thinking. But Christine and her late husband Doug weren't your typical land barons. Doug had made his fortune founding the North Face and Esprit. They could have bought yachts and mansions. Instead, they bought entire ecosystems. They called it conservation at scale. The negotiations took years. Local communities were suspicious. They'd seen foreign companies promise development and jobs, then leave environmental disasters behind. Why should they trust these Americans who claimed they just wanted to preserve nature? Here's how Christine won them over. She didn't just protect the land, she invested in the communities around it. Eco-lodges run by local families, guide training programs for young people, markets for traditional crafts. She proved that conservation could be an economic engine, not an economic dead end. The breakthrough moment came when Chile's president, Michelle Bachelet, stood with Christine to announce the creation of 5 new national parks. 5! Including the crown jewel, Alehu, Pumalin Park, protecting ancient Alurs trees that were already old when Jesus was born. The ceremony was incredible. Bachelet called it the Dos Modes, largest private land donation in history. But for Christine, standing there as thousands of acres officially became protected forever, it was just the beginning. Because on the other side of the world, Alan Savory was proving that everything we thought we knew about fighting deserts was completely wrong. Alan's story starts in Zimbabwe, where he watched grasslands turning into dust bowls despite all our best conservation efforts. The conventional wisdom said grazing animals were the problem. Keep cattle and wildlife away from fragile lands. Let them rest, and they'll recover. Alan tried that approach. It failed spectacularly. The land got worse. So he tried something that seemed absolutely insane. Instead of keeping animals away from degraded land, he brought in massive herds. Not just a few cattle, thousands of them, managed to mimic the ancient migration patterns of wild herds. His neighbors thought he'd lost his mind. His colleagues questioned his sanity. But Alan had studied how ecosystems worked before humans changed everything. He realized that grasslands had evolved with huge herds of grazing animals. Without them, the grasslands died. The results spoke for themselves. Land that had been barren for decades started growing grass again. Cracked earth became green savanna. Before and after photos looked so dramatic that people accused him of faking them. But it was real. Alan had discovered something profound. You could reverse desertification using cattle as a technology. The animals weren't the problem. How we managed them was the problem. His technique spread across Africa, then to Australia, then to ranches in Texas and Montana. Millions of acres of degraded land came back to life using Alan's holistic management approach. You know what the really beautiful part is? Alan wasn't working against nature. He was working with it. He'd figured out how to make human agriculture mimic natural processes. The cattle became proxy buffalo, proxy wildebeest, proxy zebra, playing the ecological role that wild herds had played for millions of years. But here's where the story gets even more interesting. While Christine was buying land to preserve it and Alan was using cattle to restore it, something magical was happening when indigenous knowledge met modern science. In Australia, Aboriginal communities had been managing landscapes with fire for 60,000 years. 60,000! That's longer than modern humans have existed anywhere else on Earth. They had techniques for using controlled burns to prevent catastrophic wildfires, encourage new growth, and maintain biodiversity. For decades, Australian fire management ignored this knowledge. The result? Catastrophic wildfires that destroyed millions of acres and killed billions of animals. But then, finally, scientists started paying attention to what Aboriginal fire practitioners had been saying all along. The difference was dramatic. Traditional Aboriginal burning created a mosaic landscape, MGT. Some areas recently burned, some areas recovering, some areas mature. When wildfires hit these traditionally managed areas, they couldn't spread. The mosaic pattern acted like a natural firebreak. In the Pacific Northwest, First Nations communities showed how to manage forests for maximum biodiversity while still harvesting sustainably. They'd been doing it for thousands of years before European settlers arrived with clear-cutting techniques. The results spoke for themselves. Indigenous managed forests had more species diversity, better soil health, cleaner water, and more carbon storage than any other management system. They were living proof that humans could be a positive force in ecosystems. But not everyone was ready to accept this peaceful coexistence between humans and nature. Some people wanted to go much further. Enter the rewilding rebels. In Scotland, Paul Lister bought 23,000 acres of Highland estate and announced plans that made headlines around the world. He wanted to release wolves and bears in Scotland, where they'd been extinct for centuries. The government said absolutely not. The local farmers said absolutely not. The sheep industry said absolutely not. Paul said he was doing it anyway. Now, he couldn't actually release wolves and bears without government permission. That would have been illegal and dangerous. But he could start with other species. He brought in wild boar, which had been extinct in Scotland for 400 years. The boar escaped. Of course they did. They're wild boar. Suddenly, Scotland had a free-ranging population of wild pigs rooting through forests, creating clearings for wildflowers, disturbing soil for tree seedlings, playing the ecological role they'd played for thousands of years. Some people were furious. Others were fascinated. Paul just kept buying more land and releasing more species. His ultimate goal? To rewild the Scottish Highlands completely, bringing back every species that had lived there before humans drove them extinct. In the Netherlands, an even more ambitious experiment was underway. The Oostvaardersplassen project created a Pleistocene ecosystem from scratch. On land that had been underwater just decades earlier, scientists introduced massive auroch-like cattle, conic horses, and red deer. The idea was to recreate the ecosystem that had existed in Europe before agriculture, arrest grasslands maintained by large herbivores, predators keeping everything in balance. For years it worked beautifully. The animals bred, the populations grew, the ecosystem developed complexity and resilience. Wildlife photographers came from around the world to capture images of this new wilderness. But then came the test. A harsh winter hit, and thousands of animals starved to death. The public was horrified. Images of dead horses and cattle in the snow sparked national outrage. Animal rights activists demanded the experiment be shut down. The debate was fierce. Was this really conservation, or was it cruelty? Should humans intervene to feed the animals, or was starvation a natural part of ecosystem function? The lesson was profound, but difficult. True rewilding means accepting nature's rules, including death. It means understanding that individual animal welfare and ecosystem health sometimes conflict. It means admitting that nature isn't always gentle or comfortable or easy to watch. Each pioneer faced the same fundamental question. How do you convince humanity to retreat from landscapes we've dominated for centuries? The answer came from an unexpected source: young people who grew up with climate anxiety. Generation Z didn't ask if we should rewild half the Earth. They asked why we were taking so long. They'd grown up watching the planet burn, literally. They'd seen the news about species extinctions, ocean acidification, climate change. For them, the half-Earth proposal wasn't radical. It was obviously necessary. They organized school strikes. They sued governments for climate inaction. They voted for leaders who took environmental issues seriously. They changed what was politically possible. Greta Thunberg became the global face of this movement, but she was just one voice among millions. Young people around the world were saying the same thing. Our future depends on giving the planet room to breathe. And they had something the older generation often lacked. They weren't attached to the way things had always been done. They didn't see intact ecosystems as luxuries or nice-to-haves. They saw them as life support systems. When young voters started showing up at the polls, politicians took notice. When young consumers started boycotting products from companies with poor environmental records, corporations took notice. When young activists started occupying public spaces to demand action on climate change, everybody took notice. The movement found its rhythm in this intergenerational partnership. Older scientists like Edward O. Wilson provided the knowledge and credibility. Older philanthropists like Christine Tompkins provided the resources and experience. Young activists provided the urgency and political pressure. But perhaps most importantly, indigenous communities provided the proof that it was possible. They'd been practicing sustainable relationships with nature for millennia. They had the knowledge, the legal rights, and increasingly, the political power to protect vast areas of land and sea. In Brazil, satellite data proved that indigenous managed forests survived deforestation better than government parks. In Australia, Aboriginal managed lands showed higher biodiversity than conventional conservation areas. In North America, First Nations communities were at the forefront of large-scale restoration projects. The collaboration between indigenous knowledge and modern science created solutions nobody could have imagined alone. Satellite technology combined with traditional ecological knowledge, DNA analysis combined with oral histories, climate modeling combined with ancestral memory. Each success story inspired 10 more attempts. Each failure provided lessons for the next experiment. The movement was learning, adapting, evolving as fast as the ecosystems they were trying to restore. And then came the moment that changed everything. The moment when someone proved that these local successes could scale up to transform entire landscapes. The moment when the theory of rewilding met the reality of modern technology and produced something absolutely extraordinary. That's where our story goes next, to the places where the great transformation truly began to reshape the face of the earth. You know what's absolutely mind-blowing? Sometimes the most profound changes start with the smallest actions, and I'm about to tell you about 14 animals that literally rewrote the rules of how ecosystems work. The cascade began in Yellowstone, January 1995. Picture this scene. 14 wolves, carried from Canada in metal crates, stepping onto the snow of America's first national park. They looked around, sniffed the air, and started walking into what would become the most famous ecology experiment in modern history. Now, everyone expected the wolves to hunt elk. That's what wolves do, right? But what happened next? Nobody saw it coming. Not the scientists, not the park rangers, not the environmentalists who had fought for 20 years to bring wolves back to Yellowstone. The wolves didn't just hunt elk, they changed how elk behaved. The elk, suddenly afraid of being ambushed, stopped lingering in valleys where they were vulnerable. They stopped browsing along riverbanks where wolves could surprise them. They became nervous, vigilant, constantly moving. And that's when the magic happened. Without constant elk pressure, trees exploded back to life along the rivers. Aspen, willow, cottonwood, co-species that had been browsed down to stubble for 70 years suddenly shot up to their full height. In just 5 years, what had been barren riverbanks became lush forests. But wait, it gets better. The roots of those trees stabilized the riverbanks. Rivers that had been cutting deeper and wider channels every year suddenly became stable. Some rivers actually changed course as their banks strengthened. The new forests created habitat for songbirds that hadn't been seen in the park for decades. The stabilized rivers created pools for fish, and then, after 70 years of absence, beavers came home. Think about that for a second. The wolves brought back the beavers. Not directly, they didn't carry beavers in their mouths or anything, but by changing elk behavior, which grew trees, which stabilized rivers, which created the habitat beavers needed. The beaver dams created wetlands. The wetlands brought otters, muskrats, frogs, salamanders. Each species created conditions for the next. The wolves had triggered what scientists call a trophic cascade, changes that rippled through every level of the ecosystem. This became the template for rewilding projects around the world. Find the missing keystone species, AB, the one whose absence was causing everything else to fall apart, and bring it back. Let nature do the engineering. The Yellowstone example was so powerful that it inspired what I can only describe as a global rewilding revolution. In Mozambique's Gorongosa National Park, decimated by 15 years of civil war, scientists decided to try the Yellowstone approach. The park had been a paradise. Lions, elephants, buffalo, hundreds of species living in abundance. Then war turned it into a wasteland. 95% of the large mammals were gone. The ecosystem had collapsed. Instead of trying to rebuild everything at once, the team focused on bringing back just one species, waterbuck. Medium-sized antelopes, not particularly glamorous, but they'd been the foundation of the park's food web. Within months of releasing the first waterbuck herds, something extraordinary happened. Lions showed up. Nobody transported them there, but they just arrived. Where did they come from? How did they know the waterbuck were back? Here's what's wild. These lions had been hiding in remote corners of the park, surviving on scraps, barely hanging on. When the waterbuck returned, it was like someone had turned on a dinner bell. The lions came out of hiding and started thriving again. But that's not the end. The lions attracted wild dogs, which had also been hiding somewhere in the landscape. The wild dogs brought different hunting pressure, which changed how prey species behaved, which changed where they grazed, which changed the vegetation patterns. Then elephants started returning. Slowly at first, then in larger groups. Then hippos came back to the rivers. Each species that returned created conditions for the next one to follow. It was like watching an ecosystem rebuild itself from memory, as if the land itself remembered what it was supposed to be and was just waiting for permission to become it again. The transformation accelerated when scientists started using technology to understand these hidden patterns. Satellite tracking revealed something absolutely incredible: animal highways that were completely invisible to human eyes. In Kenya, researchers put GPS collars on elephants and discovered that a matriarch was walking the exact same path her great-grandmother had used 60 years earlier. The same trees for shade, the same water sources, the same routes between feeding areas. Even though no elephant had walked that path in decades, the knowledge was still there, passed down through generations. These ancient routes became the blueprint for wildlife corridors. Scientists realized that animals already knew where the highways should go. Humans just needed to stop blocking them. The Yellowstone to Yukon corridor became the prototype: 2,000 miles of connected wilderness, stretching from Wyoming to northern Canada. Not one continuous piece of land, that would be impossible, but a network of protected areas linked by corridors that animals could use to move between them. Bears in Montana could reach mates in Canada. Wolves could expand their territory across international borders. Gene pools that had been isolated and weakening for a century suddenly mixed and strengthened. And here's what really got people excited: it worked better than anyone had predicted. Within 10 years, grizzly bear populations were no longer endangered. Wolf packs were establishing territories in places they hadn't been seen for a century. Mountain goats, wolverines, lynx, species that needed vast territories to survive, were thriving again. The success was so dramatic that other regions started copying the model. The European Greenbelt, following the former Iron Curtain from the Arctic Ocean to the Black Sea. The Jaguar Corridor, connecting protected areas from Mexico to Argentina. The Great Eastern Ranges in Australia, linking mountain ecosystems along the continent's eastern coast. But you know what really blew my mind? Ocean rewilding produced even more dramatic results than land-based projects. When marine protected areas were created, we're talking about areas as large as Texas, where fishing was completely prohibited. The ocean responded faster than anyone thought possible. In the Philippines, a tiny protected area increased fish populations by 400% in just 5 years. 400%! Can you imagine? It was like discovering that the ocean had been holding its breath for decades and finally exhaling. But here's the beautiful part. The fish didn't just stay in their protected area like well-behaved pets. They spilled out into surrounding waters, creating what scientists called spillover effects. Fishermen who had opposed the protected areas suddenly found their catches tripling. The Great Barrier Reef Marine Park became the model for ocean conservation worldwide. By protecting just 33% of the reef system, Australia created population explosions that benefited the entire region. Fish populations inside protected zones grew so large that juvenile fish colonized damaged areas outside the parks, essentially reseeding the entire ecosystem. But perhaps the most shocking success story came from an unexpected place. Cities. I know what you're thinking. Cities? How can concrete jungles be part of rewilding? But that's exactly what started happening. Cities began rewilding themselves, and the results were extraordinary. Seoul, South Korea, tore down a highway that had covered the Cheonggyecheon River for 40 years. They daylighted the river, created parks along its banks, and reintroduced native fish and birds. Property values along the river increased by 25%. The temperature in downtown Seoul dropped by several degrees during summer. Air quality improved dramatically. Singapore took the concept even further. They mandated that new buildings include nature, not just green roofs, but entire ecosystems, climbing glass towers, vertical forests with trees, shrubs, vines, even small waterfalls. The buildings became habitat for birds, butterflies, and small mammals. The results were so impressive that other cities started competing to outgreen each other. Milan built the Bosco Verticale, MAI, vertical forest towers that house 900 trees and 20,000 plants. Each tower produces enough oxygen for 400 people, while absorbing carbon dioxide and filtering air pollution. London reintroduced beavers to urban waterways after 400 years of absence. The beavers built dams that reduced flooding, improved water quality, and created habitat for dozens of other species. Property owners along the rivers saw their flood insurance rates drop significantly, but my favourite urban rewilding story has to be from Toronto. After volunteers documented thousands of bird deaths from window strikes, the city mandated bird-safe glass for all new construction. The solution was ingenious: patterns that birds could see but humans couldn't. Within 5 years, bird deaths dropped by 80%, and downtown Toronto became a stopover point for migrating species. The technology for urban wildlife corridors evolved rapidly. Green corridors connected every park in the city, creating highways for urban wildlife. Coyotes started denning in abandoned lots. Hawks nested on skyscrapers. Salmon returned to urban streams that had been polluted for decades. Each urban success story inspired rural communities to try even bolder experiments. If cities could coexist with nature, why not farms? Why not suburbs? Why not entire regions? The agriculture revolution proved to be the most crucial piece of the puzzle, because you can't give half the earth back to nature if you can't feed 10 billion people on the other half. But this is where human ingenuity really started to shine. Vertical farms in Japan were producing 100 times more food per square foot than traditional farming. 100 times! These weren't small experimental plots. We're talking about production facilities that could feed entire cities. The secret was precision agriculture taken to its logical extreme. LED lights tuned to exactly the wavelengths plants needed. Nutrients delivered drop by drop to individual roots. Climate control optimized for each stage of growth. No weather delays, no pest problems, no seasonal limitations. But the real game changer was lab-grown meat. When the first lab-grown burger was produced in 2013, it cost $300,000 to make. By 2025, the cost had dropped to under $5. By 2030, lab-grown meat was cheaper than conventional meat and indistinguishable in taste. Suddenly, the vast grasslands used for cattle ranching could return to their natural state. The Amazon rainforest could stop being cleared for soy farms to feed livestock. Billions of acres of agricultural land could be rewilded without anyone going hungry. The Netherlands became the perfect example of how to do more with less space. Despite being smaller than West Virginia, they became the world's second-largest food exporter through intensive greenhouse cultivation. Tomatoes growing in precisely controlled environments, producing 20 times more fruit per plant than field-grown varieties. Energy infrastructure shrank to almost nothing. Fusion reactors the size of warehouses replaced coal plants that covered square miles. Solar panels became so efficient that rooftops could power entire cities. Wind turbines were redesigned so birds could see and avoid them. The human footprint, which had been stomping across continents for centuries, became a careful tiptoe. Digital technology enabled what scientists called the Great Consolidation. Virtual reality became so convincing that people preferred digital travel to physical travel. Why fly to Paris when you could experience it through VR that included smell, touch, and perfect visual detail? Remote work eliminated millions of daily commutes. Automation allowed one person to do jobs that previously required 10 people. Artificial intelligence optimized everything from energy use to transportation routes. Humans didn't need half the Earth because humans suddenly realized they didn't need half of what they thought they needed. But perhaps the most profound change was in how people thought about their relationship with nature. The generation growing up with rewilded landscapes didn't see nature as something separate from human civilization. They saw it as part of the infrastructure that made human civilization possible. Clean water came from healthy watersheds. Clean air came from thriving forests. Climate stability came from intact ecosystems. Mental health came from access to wild spaces. Physical health came from biodiversity that supported everything from soil microbes to the bacteria in human guts. The Half-Earth movement wasn't about giving up half the planet. It was about investing in the life support systems that made the other half work. And the returns on that investment were about to exceed everyone's wildest dreams. Now here's where the story gets really fascinating. Making Half-Earth actually work required solving a problem that nobody had ever tackled before. How do you create a boundary between human and natural spaces that both sides can live with? The answer came from the most unlikely source you could imagine: highway engineers. Think about it. These are the people who figured out how to move millions of cars safely through complex networks every single day. They understand traffic flow, bottlenecks, accident prevention, and efficient routing better than anyone on the planet. So when wildlife biologists started complaining about animals getting killed trying to cross highways, somebody had a brilliant idea. Why not apply highway engineering principles to animal movement? The Banff Wildlife Crossings in Canada became the prototype that changed everything. Picture this: massive bridges covered with native vegetation, spanning 6-lane highways. To a driver, they look like hills. To animals, they're just part of the landscape. But here's what's absolutely incredible. The animals had to learn to use them. Nobody taught them. There was no animal orientation session. The first few months, most animals were too nervous to cross these strange elevated paths. Then one brave elk decided to try it. Other elk watched and followed. Within a year, entire herds were using the crossings like they'd been there forever. Wolves started hunting on the bridges. Bears brought their cubs across to teach them the route. The crossing cameras captured something magical: animals teaching their young to use these human-built wildlife highways. Cultural transmission happening in real time. New traditions being born. The success was so dramatic that wildlife crossings started appearing everywhere. But engineers didn't stop with simple bridges. They got creative, adapting designs for different species and landscapes. For small animals, they built tunnels under roads. Amphibians got their own tiny highways with specialized moisture control. Fish got fish ladders that turned impassable dams into stepping stones. The technology evolved rapidly. Smart fences in Kenya started texting farmers when elephants approached their crops. Yes, texting. Motion sensors detected elephant movement and sent automatic alerts. Elephants heading toward your farm. Estimated arrival 20 minutes. But the really elegant solution was working with animal behavior instead of against it. Beehive fences exploited elephants' natural fear of bees. A simple string of beehives around a farm perimeter kept elephants away without harming them. When elephants touched the fence, disturbed bees would buzz angrily, and the elephants would retreat. In India, villagers discovered that chili smoke barriers worked even better than electric fences. Elephants hate the smell of burning chilies. A few strategically placed chili fires could redirect entire herds away from crops. Simple, cheap, effective, and completely non-harmful. The principle became clear. Work with animal behavior, not against it. Understanding what animals naturally avoid or prefer was far more effective than trying to force them to behave differently. Cities transformed into arcs using these same principles. Toronto's bird-safe glass mandate became the model for urban wildlife protection worldwide. The solution was brilliant in its simplicity. Patterns that birds could see but humans couldn't. The patterns were based on how spiders build webs. Spiders don't want birds flying into their webs any more than cities want birds hitting windows. So spider silk reflects ultraviolet light in patterns that birds can see clearly but are invisible to human eyes. Engineers created glass with similar UV reflective patterns. To humans, the windows looked perfectly clear. To birds, they looked like barriers to avoid. Bird deaths from window strikes dropped by 80% virtually overnight. Green corridors connected urban parks, creating wildlife highways through city centers. These weren't just pretty landscaping. They were engineered wildlife infrastructure. The width, vegetation, and positioning were all calculated to maximize animal movement while minimizing human-wildlife conflicts. The results exceeded everyone's expectations. Coyotes began denning in abandoned lots, controlling rodent populations better than any pest control service. Hawks nested on skyscrapers, their keen eyesight making them perfect urban security systems. Salmon returned to urban streams, their presence indicating dramatically improved water quality. But the real breakthrough came when cities realized they could engineer ecosystems, not just accommodate them. Singapore became the world's laboratory for integrated urban ecology. New buildings weren't just green, they were living ecosystems. Vertical forests climbed glass towers, creating habitat corridors in 3 dimensions. The engineering was incredibly sophisticated. Each floor's ecosystem was designed to support the floors above and below it. Water cascaded from level to level, creating mini watersheds within buildings. Root systems were engineered to manage stormwater, reduce building sway, and filter air. The trees weren't just decoration, they were infrastructure. They provided oxygen, absorbed carbon dioxide, filtered air pollution, reduced urban heat islands, and managed stormwater runoff. The buildings became positive contributors to urban ecology instead of neutral boxes. But perhaps the most ambitious engineering project was redesigning agriculture itself. The Netherlands proved it was possible to feed the world while using a fraction of traditional farmland. Their secret? Treating farming like a precision manufacturing process instead of a traditional agricultural practice. Greenhouses became food factories. Every variable was controlled and optimized. Light, temperature, humidity, nutrients, even air composition. Plants grew faster, bigger, and more nutritiously than anything possible in traditional farming. But here's what really blew my mind. These facilities used 95% less water than traditional agriculture. 95%. They recycled every drop, captured every nutrient, eliminated all waste. Vertical farms took the concept even further. 30-story towers producing more food per square foot than any traditional farm could imagine. No weather delays, no seasonal limitations, no pest problems, no pesticides, no herbicides. The first vertical farm in Singapore was producing 1,000 times more vegetables per square foot than traditional farming. 1,000 times. And they were doing it in the middle of a city, with no soil, using only LED lights and precisely controlled nutrient solutions. Lab-grown meat eliminated the need for vast grazing lands entirely. When scientists figured out how to grow real meat from animal cells without raising and slaughtering animals, everything changed. The first lab-grown burger cost $300,000 to produce, but the price dropped exponentially every year. By 2025, lab-grown meat was cost-competitive with conventional meat. By 2030, it was cheaper and tastier. Suddenly, the billions of acres used for livestock could return to their natural state. The Amazon didn't need to be cleared for cattle ranches. The Great Plains could support buffalo again instead of beef cattle. Energy infrastructure underwent the same dramatic miniaturization. Fusion reactors the size of warehouses could power entire cities. Solar panels became so efficient that building rooftops could generate surplus electricity. But the real game changer was energy storage. When batteries became cheap enough and powerful enough to store renewable energy for weeks at a time, the entire energy equation changed. Every building became a potential power plant. Wind turbines were redesigned to be visible to birds and bats. The old white turbines that blended into cloudy skies were replaced with designs that birds could see and avoid. Bird and bat deaths from wind turbines dropped by 90%. The human footprint shrank dramatically. Cities became more dense and efficient. Suburbs gave way to rewilded landscapes. The great human consolidation made half Earth possible without anyone sacrificing quality of life. Digital technology enabled lifestyle changes that previous generations couldn't have imagined. Virtual reality became so convincing that digital travel often surpassed physical travel in terms of experience. Why fly to the Serengeti when you could experience a virtual safari that included smells, sounds, and tactile sensations impossible in real life? You could walk among dinosaurs, swim with extinct marine reptiles, experience landscapes from any point in Earth's history. Remote work eliminated billions of commute miles annually. Autonomous vehicles meant fewer cars needed overall, since transportation became a service rather than a possession. When you could summon a car with a thought and have it arrive in minutes, why own one? Artificial intelligence optimized resource use with precision that human planners could never match. Traffic flows, energy distribution, food production, waste management, everything became more efficient through intelligent automation. The result was a civilization that met all human needs, while using a fraction of the resources that previous generations had considered necessary. But engineering the Great Divide wasn't just about technology. It required understanding the subtle psychology of human nature boundaries. The most successful rewilding projects created what psychologists called graduated wildness. Instead of sharp boundaries between human and natural spaces, they created transition zones where wildness gradually increased. Near cities, parks looked managed and comfortable. Further out, the landscape became more rugged. At the edges of truly wild areas, the environment became genuinely challenging and unpredictable. This graduated approach meant people could experience whatever level of wildness they were comfortable with. Families with young children could enjoy nature in safe, predictable environments. Adventure seekers could push into truly wild spaces where anything might happen. The psychological impact was profound. People developed what researchers called nested identity, seeing themselves as part of ever larger natural systems. Their neighborhood, their bioregion, their continent, their planet. This wasn't abstract environmentalism. It was direct, personal connection to the life support systems that made human civilization possible. And that connection created a feedback loop that nobody had anticipated. The more people experienced restored nature, the more they wanted to protect it. The more they protected it, the more it recovered. The more it recovered, the more benefits it provided to human communities. Conservation became self-reinforcing. Each success created conditions for greater success. Each recovered ecosystem demonstrated the value of recovery to neighboring communities. The engineering challenges that had seemed impossible a decade earlier became routine problems with well-known solutions. Moving animals safely across human infrastructure, integrating ecosystems into urban design, feeding billions of people on minimal land, powering civilization with minimal environmental impact. The tools existed, the knowledge existed, the political will was growing stronger every year. All that remained was scaling these solutions up to planetary size. And that's where the story gets really extraordinary. You want to know the moment when everything changed? When some accountant in New York City discovered that trees were worth $9 billion. Let me paint you this picture. New York gets its drinking water from watersheds in the Catskill Mountains, about 100 miles north of the city. For decades, the water was pure enough that it didn't need filtration, just some basic treatment, and it was ready to drink. But by the 1990s, development and pollution in the watershed meant the water quality was declining. The federal government told New York they had two choices: build a massive water filtration plant or fix the watershed. The filtration plant would cost $9 billion, plus hundreds of millions annually to operate. Or they could spend $1.5 billion buying land around the reservoirs, paying farmers to reduce pollution, and restoring natural filtration systems. The trees, soil, and wetlands would clean the water for free, forever. New York chose the trees, and that decision changed how the entire world thinks about the economics of nature, because suddenly everybody started doing the math. If trees in New York were worth $9 billion in water filtration services, what were trees everywhere else worth? The answer was staggering. Wetlands turned out to be worth $15,000 per acre per year in flood protection alone, not over decades, per year. They absorbed storm surges, slowed floodwaters, and recharged groundwater aquifers better than any human-engineered system. Hurricane Katrina drove this point home in the most devastating way possible. The Louisiana wetlands that had protected New Orleans for centuries had been destroyed by development and oil drilling. When Katrina hit, there was nothing to slow the storm surge. The city flooded, but here's what really opened people's eyes. The areas where wetlands remained intact suffered minimal damage. The wetlands had absorbed the hurricane's energy like a massive natural shock absorber. Mangroves proved even more valuable. A single acre of healthy mangrove forest provided more coastal protection than a concrete seawall at 1% of the cost. And unlike seawalls, mangroves got stronger over time as they grew and spread. Countries started calculating their natural capital, the economic value of their forests, wetlands, coral reefs, and other ecosystems. The numbers were mind-blowing. Costa Rica's forests were generating $4 billion annually in tourism alone. $4 billion! From people who just wanted to see trees and animals in their natural habitat. But the real revelation came when scientists started measuring unexpected economic benefits that nobody had thought to quantify. In Japan, doctors began prescribing forest bathing, Shinrin-yoku, for patients with stress, anxiety, and depression. Spending time in wild spaces measurably reduced cortisol levels, lowered blood pressure, and boosted immune function. Healthcare costs dropped significantly in areas with easy access to nature. Children with ADHD showed reduced symptoms after time in green spaces. Adults recovered from surgery faster when they could see trees from their hospital windows. The economic value of these mental health improvements alone justified conservation costs. Japan started calculating the healthcare savings from forest access, achieving billions of dollars annually in reduced medical expenses. But wait, it gets even more interesting. The job market transformed completely as the green economy exploded. Ecological restoration started employing more people than coal mining within a single decade. These weren't low-skill jobs either. Restoration required expertise in ecology, hydrology, soil science, and wildlife management. Indigenous guides became the highest-paid consultants in the industry. Corporations desperate to understand sustainable land management were paying indigenous communities hundreds of thousands of dollars for traditional ecological knowledge. Former loggers became forest guardians, earning more money protecting trees than they'd ever made cutting them down. The transition wasn't always easy, but the economic incentives were clear. Conservation paid better than extraction. Carbon markets exploded when scientists realized that rewilded land sequestered carbon faster than any human technology. A single restored peatland in Scotland locked away carbon, equivalent to taking 1 million cars off the road. And it did this every year, for decades. Governments started paying landowners to rewild their property. Farmers could earn more money letting their land return to forest than they could growing crops on it. Doing nothing became more profitable than doing something. Wildlife tourism revolutionized entire national economies. Rwanda's mountain gorillas generated $400 million annually from tourism. $400 million from a population of fewer than 1,000 animals. Think about that math. Each gorilla was worth nearly $500,000 per year to Rwanda's economy. Alive, these animals were incredibly valuable. Dead, they were worthless. Costa Rica figured this out early and went all in on conservation tourism. They protected 25% of their land and turned it into a tourism magnet. Visitors came from around the world to see intact rainforests, pristine beaches, and abundant wildlife. The country marketed itself as having the highest biodiversity per square mile on Earth. They weren't wrong. Costa Rica contains 4% of all known species despite covering only 0.03% of the planet's surface. Tourism became Costa Rica's largest industry, bringing in more revenue than coffee, bananas, and all other traditional exports combined. The country proved that nature was worth more intact than destroyed. Other countries took notice and started competing to protect the most land. Bhutan mandated that 60% of the country remain forested forever. They weren't just protecting trees, they were protecting their economic future. The feedback loops accelerated everything. More nature meant cleaner water, which meant healthier people, which meant higher productivity, which meant more resources for conservation. Cleaner air reduced respiratory diseases and healthcare costs. Intact ecosystems provided natural pest control, reducing the need for expensive pesticides. Biodiversity supported soil health, increasing agricultural productivity on the land that remained in farming. The half-Earth economy wasn't just sustainable, it was regenerative. Each year built more wealth than the last because healthy ecosystems grow and improve over time. But perhaps the most surprising economic discovery was how much money society had been wasting on problems that nature could solve for free. Flood control? Wetlands did it better than levees and dams, at a fraction of the cost. Air purification? Trees removed pollutants more effectively than industrial air filters. Pest control? Birds and bats eliminated agricultural pests without any toxic chemicals. Water purification? Natural systems cleaned water so thoroughly that some cities stopped using chemical treatment entirely. Soil formation? Healthy ecosystems built topsoil that industrial agriculture destroyed. Climate regulation? Forests created their own weather patterns, moderating temperature and precipitation more effectively than any human technology. Every function that human civilization needed, nature had been providing for free. We'd just been too busy destroying it to notice. The insurance industry was among the first to embrace natural infrastructure. Insurance companies understood risk better than anyone, and they quickly realized that natural systems reduced risk more effectively than engineered systems. Properties protected by wetlands got lower flood insurance rates. Buildings surrounded by fire-resistant native vegetation got discounts on wildfire coverage. Coastal developments behind healthy coral reefs paid less for storm damage protection. The insurance incentives drove massive private investment in ecosystem restoration. Property owners didn't restore wetlands out of environmental sentiment. They did it to save money on insurance premiums. Real estate values near protected natural areas consistently outperformed the market. People would pay premium prices to live near intact ecosystems. The economic signal was clear. Nature wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity that people valued highly. Even the tech industry discovered that nature was good for business. Companies like Google and Apple started locating offices near natural areas because employees were more productive, more creative, and less likely to quit when they had access to wild spaces. The concept of biophilic design, incorporating natural elements into buildings and workspaces, became standard practice, not because it looked nice, but because it measurably improved employee performance and reduced healthcare costs. Studies showed that workers in offices with natural light, plants, and views of green spaces were 25% more productive than those in traditional sterile environments. 25%, just from adding some trees and natural light. The pharmaceutical industry made perhaps the most surprising discovery of all. Many of our most important medicines came from wild plants and animals. Aspirin from willow bark, digitalis from foxglove, penicillin from bread mold. As species went extinct, we were losing potential medicines faster than we could discover them. Some estimates suggested that extinction was costing the pharmaceutical industry billions of dollars annually in lost opportunities. Suddenly, pharmaceutical companies became major funders of biodiversity conservation. They weren't being altruistic, they were protecting their research and development pipeline. The military reached similar conclusions about ecosystem services. Healthy forests prevented soil erosion that clogged rivers and harbors. Intact coastal ecosystems protected naval bases from storm damage. Stable watersheds provided reliable water supplies for military installations. The Pentagon started including ecosystem protection in national security planning. Climate change and environmental degradation were recognized as threat multipliers that could destabilize entire regions. Every sector of the economy, from tourism to technology to national defense, discovered that healthy ecosystems were essential to their bottom line. The old economic model, extract resources, pollute the environment, pay later, was revealed as incredibly expensive. The costs had just been hidden, passed on to future generations, or absorbed by natural systems that seemed infinite. The new economic model, invest in natural systems, let them provide services, profit from the results, was not only more sustainable, but more profitable. Countries that embraced this model early gained enormous competitive advantages. They attracted more tourists, more investment, more high-quality businesses. Their citizens were healthier, more productive, and happier. The half-Earth economy wasn't just an environmental movement, it was an economic revolution that made everyone wealthier while healing the planet. But as with any revolution, not everyone was ready to embrace the change. The old economic powers, fossil fuel companies, industrial agriculture, extractive industries, weren't going to give up without a fight. That's where our story takes a dramatic turn, as the forces of conservation collided with the forces of business as usual. Not everyone celebrated humanity's retreat from half the planet. In fact, the first and most surprising backlash came from a group you'd never expect, environmentalists themselves. Picture this scene: a heated meeting in a Scottish community centre, voices raised, decades of careful conservation work suddenly questioned. On one side, traditional conservationists who'd spent their entire careers managing landscapes. On the other, rewilding advocates arguing that centuries of human management should be abandoned. The issue? Scotland's famous sheep pastures. For 800 years, sheep had grazed the Scottish Highlands, creating the iconic landscape that millions of tourists came to see. Rolling green hills, stone walls, picturesque farms, it was Scotland's brand. But ecologists argued that these landscapes were ecological disasters. Before sheep, the Highlands had been covered with ancient Caledonian forests. The natural Scotland wasn't green hills, it was dense woodland filled with wolves, bears and lynx. Rewilding advocates wanted to remove the sheep and let the forests, rewilding, to return. Traditional conservationists argued that the current landscape had its own value and supported rural communities that had lived there for generations. The fights were fierce. Families split over whether their ancestral lands should return to wilderness. Tourism operators worried that visitors wouldn't come to see forests instead of pastoral landscapes. Farmers faced the prospect of giving up livelihoods that went back centuries. The debate revealed a fundamental tension in the conservation movement. What exactly were we trying to conserve? The landscape as it existed now? The landscape as it had existed before human influence? Or something entirely new? These questions became even more complex when indigenous rights entered the picture. Many rewilding projects sat on stolen land. The uncomfortable truth was that some of the most pristine wilderness areas had been created by forcing indigenous peoples off their ancestral territories. National parks in the United States, game reserves in Africa, protected areas around the world, ONOS, many had been established through cultural genocide. Now, as the rewilding movement gained momentum, there was a real risk of repeating these historical injustices. Who had the right to decide what landscapes should look like? Who got to determine which species belonged where? The solution required humility from the conservation movement. Instead of treating indigenous peoples as stakeholders to be consulted, they needed to be recognized as senior partners with authority over their traditional territories. In Brazil, this shift produced remarkable results. Satellite data proved conclusively that indigenous-managed forests survived deforestation pressure better than government-protected parks. Indigenous territories covered just 13% of Brazil but contained 80% of the country's biodiversity. The Kayapo people of the Amazon had been protecting millions of acres using traditional knowledge that allowed sustainable hunting, fishing, and agriculture without damaging forest ecosystems. They didn't need to learn conservation from outsiders. They needed outsiders to stop interfering with conservation systems that had worked for thousands of years. In California, the Yurok tribe brought back California condors from the brink of extinction. These massive birds, with wingspans reaching 10 feet, had been reduced to just 27 individuals in the 1980s. Everyone assumed they were doomed. But the Yurok people considered condors sacred relatives, not just wildlife. They combined traditional ceremonies with modern breeding techniques, creating cultural connections that made conservation personally meaningful to tribal members. The program succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Condor populations recovered, and the birds started showing behaviors that captive breeding programs had never seen. The traditional knowledge had preserved understanding of condor ecology that science had missed. Similar partnerships emerged worldwide. In Australia, Aboriginal fire management prevented catastrophic wildfires better than any modern fire suppression technique. In Alaska, Inuit communities managed marine mammal populations more sustainably than government regulations. The pattern was clear. Indigenous knowledge combined with modern tools achieved results that neither could accomplish alone. But even with indigenous partnerships, rewilding faced serious practical challenges. The predator problem tested everyone's resolve. When wolves returned to Germany, they discovered that livestock made much easier prey than wild deer. Why chase a healthy deer through dense forest when you could take a sheep from a fenced pasture? The old solution, kill the wolves, was off the table. Germany was committed to rewilding, and wolves were a protected species, but farmers were losing animals and livelihood. The breakthrough came from traditional livestock protection methods that had been abandoned during the wolf-free centuries. Guardian dogs, breeds like the Great Pyrenees and Anatolian Shepherd that had been developed specifically to fight wolves, made a dramatic comeback. These weren't pet dogs. They were livestock partners, living with sheep and goats 24 hours a day, bonding with the herd and defending it against any threat. When wolves approached, the dogs didn't run away. They fought. Farmers who used guardian dogs lost almost no livestock to wolf predation. The German government provided compensation for losses and bonuses for coexistence. Most farmers chose the guardian dogs and the bonus payments. But some rewilding experiments failed spectacularly, teaching valuable lessons about the difference between restoration and wishful thinking. Pablo Escobar's escaped hippos became Colombia's most embarrassing ecological disaster. When the drug lord's private zoo was abandoned after his death, the hippos escaped into Colombian rivers. They thrived in the tropical climate, breeding faster than anyone expected. The problem? Hippos are incredibly dangerous. They kill more people in Africa than lions, crocodiles, or any other large mammal. And their ecosystem engineers, their presence completely changes river ecology. Colombian rivers had never hosted anything like hippos. The native species had no evolutionary experience with these massive, aggressive herbivores. Fish populations crashed. River vegetation disappeared. Water quality declined. But the hippos were too dangerous to remove safely and too well established to control. Colombia was stuck with an invasive species that was both deadly and ecologically destructive. Scotland's reintroduced beavers created different but equally challenging problems. The beavers did exactly what beavers do. They built dams. Lots of dams. Big dams that flooded prime agricultural land. Farmers who had initially supported beaver reintroduction watched their fields disappear under beaver ponds. The economic losses were substantial, and the compensation payments came too slowly. Some farmers took matters into their own hands, illegally removing beaver dams or shooting beavers. The government struggled to balance beaver conservation with agricultural interests. Wild boar in England created archaeological emergencies. These powerful animals, reintroduced to control invasive plants, discovered that ancient burial sites contained soft, easy-to-dig, soil perfect for rooting. Archaeological sites that had survived for thousands of years were destroyed in months as wild boar systematically excavated Roman ruins, medieval foundations, and prehistoric settlements. The historical losses were irreplaceable. Each failure taught valuable lessons about the difference between introduction and reintroduction, between native species returning to restored habitats and exotic species being placed in environments they'd never inhabited. But perhaps the biggest conflict came from within the rewilding movement itself. The debate split the conservation community into opposing camps with fundamentally different visions of what rewilding should accomplish. Pleistocene rewilders wanted to bring back Ice Age ecosystems using CRISPR genetic technology to resurrect mammoths, cave lions, and giant ground sloths. They argued that humans had caused these extinctions, so humans should reverse them. Traditional conservationists called it Jurassic Park madness. They argued that ecosystems had evolved and changed since the Pleistocene. Resurrecting extinct species and releasing them into modern landscapes was playing God with evolution. The Mammoth Resurrection Project became the flashpoint for this debate. Scientists had successfully sequenced mammoth DNA and identified the key genetic differences between mammoths and modern elephants. The technology existed to create mammoth-elephant hybrids, but should they? Elephants were already endangered. Was it ethical to experiment on them, to create creatures that had been extinct for thousands of years? Where would these resurrected mammoths live? Who would care for them? The debate raged in scientific journals, conservation conferences, and popular media. Some called it humanity's obligation to fix past mistakes. Others called it dangerous hubris. The compromise that emerged focused on recently extinct species whose ecosystems were still intact and waiting for their return. Christmas Island's native rats, Tasmanian tigers, Caribbean monk seals, the species whose disappearance had left clear ecological gaps that their resurrection could fill. But even these less controversial projects faced practical challenges. Disease transmission between wild and domestic animals sometimes produced devastating results. When rewilded wolves in Montana came into contact with domestic dogs, they spread parvovirus that killed hundreds of dogs in surrounding communities. The public backlash was swift and severe. African swine fever jumped from rewilded wild boar to domestic pigs in Eastern Europe, forcing the culling of thousands of farm animals. The economic losses ran into millions of dollars. Each disease outbreak strengthened opposition to rewilding projects. Critics argued that mixing wild and domestic animals was inherently dangerous and economically irresponsible. But veterinary science adapted quickly. Buffer zones of vaccinated wildlife became standard practice. Mobile veterinary teams monitored disease transmission. Early warning systems detected outbreaks before they could spread. The COVID pandemic's origins in wildlife markets made everyone acutely aware of the costs of pushing too far into wild spaces. Ironically, This made the half-Earth concept more appealing. Giving wildlife adequate space reduced the chances of dangerous human-animal contact. Half-Earth became a public health initiative as much as a conservation strategy. Perhaps the most persistent challenge was simple: a human psychology. People wanted rewilding to be neat, predictable, and aesthetically pleasing. They wanted wolves that only killed deer, beavers that only built dams in convenient locations, and ecosystems that looked like nature documentaries. Reality was messier. Predators sometimes killed livestock. Ecosystems went through awkward transitional phases. Natural processes included death, disease, and destruction, alongside beauty and renewal. Learning to accept this messiness, to see ecological chaos as part of natural health rather than a sign of management failure, required a fundamental shift in how humans related to the natural world. The generation born into rewilded landscapes had advantages that older generations lacked. They grew up seeing predators as normal parts of the landscape rather than dangerous invaders. They understood ecological processes intuitively rather than having to learn them intellectually, but even they faced choices about how much wildness they could accept. When young people started getting injured in rewilded areas, bitten by snakes, mauled by bears, lost in dense forests, their parents questioned whether the benefits were worth the risks. The balance between access and wildness remained an ongoing challenge. How do you let people experience true wilderness while keeping them safe? How do you maintain ecosystem integrity while accommodating human recreation? Each conflict, each failure, each ethical dilemma strengthened the movement by forcing it to confront difficult questions honestly. The Half-Earth vision wasn't about returning to some imaginary past where humans and nature existed in perfect harmony. It was about creating a future where humans and nature could coexist sustainably, accepting that this relationship would sometimes be challenging, sometimes dangerous, and always requiring active management and thoughtful compromise. The conflicts weren't obstacles to overcome. They were the growing pains of a species, learning to live within planetary boundaries for the first time in its history. The future arrived faster than anyone had predicted. By 2035, something extraordinary happened that would have seemed like science fiction just a decade earlier. The first continental wildlife corridor connected Tierra del Fuego to Alaska. Picture this moment: the jaguar, tracked by satellite collar, padding across the Arizona border into the United States. It's been a century since jaguars roamed American soil, but now, following an unbroken chain of protected corridors and restored habitats, they're coming home. The jaguar doesn't know she's making history. She's just following ancient instincts, genetic memories that remember when her ancestors traveled freely across 2 continents. The corridors she's walking were built by humans, but they follow pathways encoded in jaguar DNA for millions of years. Behind her, other species are following the same routes. Pumas, ocelots, tapirs, even slow-moving sloths are expanding their ranges northward. As climate change shifts, habitat zones and corridors provide safe passage. The sonic booms of prairie chickens echo across restored grasslands, where cornfields once stretched to the horizon. These weren't just any grasslands. They were the original tallgrass prairies that had covered the American heartland before agriculture transformed them into the world's breadbasket. The restoration hadn't required abandoning agriculture. Instead, vertical farms now produced more food than the original farmland ever had, using 95% less water and 0 pesticides. The freed land could return to its original purpose, supporting the incredible biodiversity of the grassland ecosystem. Technology merged with nature in ways that seemed almost magical. Bioengineered coral reefs grew faster than climate change could kill them. Scientists had figured out how to accelerate natural coral evolution, creating supercorals that thrived in warmer, more acidic oceans. These weren't artificial reefs. They were enhanced natural reefs, genetically identical to wild corals, but adapted to survive in the changing ocean conditions. As they spread and reproduced, they carried their enhanced resilience into wild populations. Drones planted 1 billion trees a year, with species selected by artificial intelligence for maximum ecosystem recovery. The AI analyzed soil conditions, climate projections, existing vegetation, and wildlife needs to choose exactly the right species for each location. But these weren't random tree plantings. The AI was recreating historical forest compositions with modifications for future climate conditions. Each tree was placed with surgical precision to maximize biodiversity, carbon sequestration, and ecosystem services. Synthetic biology created organisms that ate plastic pollution and then disappeared without a trace. These engineered bacteria could break down microplastics in ocean water, converting them into harmless organic compounds. After completing their cleanup mission, they were programmed to self-destruct, leaving no trace of their artificial origin. Oil spills became temporary inconveniences rather than permanent disasters. Specialized organisms could consume petroleum products, breaking them down into nutrients that actually benefited marine ecosystems. The Gulf of Mexico, still scarred from the Deepwater Horizon disaster, was finally healing completely. The generation born into the half-Earth world thought about nature in ways that previous generations could barely comprehend. They celebrated Connection Day, when new wildlife corridors linked up, creating continental ecosystems for the first time in centuries. Children grew up knowing the names of local species like previous generations had known celebrities. Career Day at schools featured rewilding engineers, interspecies communication specialists, and ecosystem restoration artists alongside traditional ex-Metcamos. Professions. These kids didn't see nature as something separate from human civilization. They saw it as the infrastructure that made human civilization possible. Clean water came from healthy watersheds. Clean air came from thriving forests. Climate stability came from intact ecosystems. They understood intuitively what previous generations had to learn, intellectually, that human prosperity and natural health were not opposing forces, but complementary aspects of the same system. Space exploration took half-Earth principles beyond Earth itself. When humans finally established permanent colonies on Mars, they planned for 50% wilderness from day one, not because Mars had existing ecosystems to protect, but because the psychological health of colonists required access to unmanaged, wild spaces. The Moon's far side became humanity's first off-world nature preserve. As strange as it sounds, people realized that even in space, humans needed places that weren't designed, managed, or optimized for human purposes. The ethics of terraforming included the rights of whatever microbial life might already exist on other worlds. Before making Mars more Earth-like, humanity spent decades studying whether Mars already hosted its own unique forms of life that deserved protection. The measurement of planetary success went far beyond species counts and protected area percentages. Rivers ran clear from mountain to sea for the first time in centuries. The night sky, freed from light pollution across half the planet, blazed with stars that urban children had never seen. Silence, perhaps the most endangered sound on Earth, returned to vast spaces, not the dead silence of lifeless places, but the living silence of healthy ecosystems where natural sounds weren't drowned out by human noise. The dawn chorus of birds became humanity's alarm clock in rewilded areas. Different each day, changing with the seasons, it marked the rhythm of natural time that humans had almost forgotten during the industrial era. But perhaps the greatest change was in the human spirit itself. The half-Earth generation didn't see nature as other, but as extended self. They understood viscerally that human health and planetary health were inseparable. They measured wealth not just in dollars, but in ecosystem services. They evaluated success not just in economic growth, but in biodiversity increase. They planned for the future not just in human generations, but but in geological time. The project that had begun as desperate conservation became conscious evolution. Homo sapiens, the wise ape, was finally living up to its name. Advanced monitoring systems tracked the health of every major ecosystem in real time. Satellite networks, sensor arrays, and AI analysis provided constant updates on biodiversity, climate stability, and ecosystem resilience. But the most important monitoring was done by the species themselves. Animals equipped with biosensors transmitted data about their health, behavior, and environmental conditions. Forests communicated through fungal networks enhanced with digital sensors. Even individual trees could report their stress levels, nutrient needs, and disease status. This wasn't surveillance, it was conversation. For the first time in history, humans could hear what nature was saying about its own condition. The results were extraordinary. Early warning systems prevented ecological disasters before they could develop. Diseases were detected and treated in wild populations before they could spread. Climate change impacts were identified and addressed at the local level. Ocean rewilding produced perhaps the most dramatic recoveries. The creation of massive marine protected areas, AFS, some larger than entire countries, triggered population explosions that restored ocean ecosystems to abundance not seen since before industrial fishing. Whale populations recovered so completely that their songs could be heard across entire ocean basins. Again, the deep ocean communication networks that had been disrupted for decades by ship noise and whale hunting returned to full function. Fish populations exploded not just in protected areas but throughout connected ocean systems. The spillover effects meant that fishing outside protected areas became more productive than fishing had been anywhere during the era of overharvesting. The economic transformation was complete. Countries competed to protect the most biodiversity, knowing that intact ecosystems attracted investment, tourism, and the most innovative industries. The old economy, based on extraction and consumption, was replaced by an economy based on restoration and regeneration. Every economic activity was measured not just by its immediate profits, but by its impact on natural capital. Young entrepreneurs built billion-dollar companies around ecosystem restoration, species recovery, and climate repair. The most successful businesses were those that made money by healing rather than harming natural systems. Carbon became a commodity that rewilded landscapes produced more efficiently than any technology. Biodiversity credits rewarded landowners for creating habitat. Ecosystem services were bought and sold in markets that recognized nature's economic value. But beyond economics, beyond technology, beyond policy, the Half-Earth movement represented something even more profound, a fundamental evolution in human consciousness. For the first time in species history, humans were voluntarily limiting their own expansion to make room for other life. They were choosing long-term planetary health over short-term human convenience. This wasn't sacrifice, it was wisdom. The Half-Earth generation understood that giving half to nature gave wholeness to humanity. They had learned what indigenous cultures had always known, that human flourishing depends absolutely on the flourishing of all life. Cities became showcases of human-nature integration. Buildings weren't just green, they were living ecosystems that housed humans alongside dozens of other species. Urban agriculture fed populations while creating habitat. Transportation systems moved people and wildlife equally efficiently. Rural areas became increasingly wild while supporting more human prosperity than ever before. Ecotourism, conservation research, and ecosystem services provided sustainable livelihoods that were actually enhanced by wildness rather than diminished by it. The great human consolidation proved that people could live more comfortably in smaller spaces when those spaces were designed for human flourishing rather than maximum capacity. Quality of life improved dramatically as cities became more livable and countryside became more wild. People had access to both urban amenities and natural experiences without the environmental destruction that had once seemed inevitable. Mental health indicators reached historic highs. as people rediscovered their connection to natural rhythms and wild spaces. Physical health improved as cleaner air, cleaner water, and more diverse food systems supported human biology in ways that industrial environments had disrupted. Educational systems taught children to read landscapes like books, understanding the stories told by soil, water, plants, and animals. Environmental literacy became as fundamental as reading and mathematics. Art, music, and literature flourished as creators drew inspiration from the returning richness of the natural world. The cultural renaissance that accompanied ecological restoration produced works of beauty that celebrated the marriage of human creativity and natural wonder. Scientific discovery accelerated as researchers gained access to restored ecosystems and recovered species. Each returning species revealed secrets about evolution, ecology, and the fundamental processes of life that could only be learned from healthy, complete, natural systems. The half-Earth planet wasn't a return to some imaginary past. It was a step forward into a future where human intelligence served life rather than dominating it, where technology enhanced rather than replaced natural systems, where civilization supported rather than competed with the wild. Standing at the end of this remarkable journey, looking back at the transformation that had seemed impossible just decades earlier, one thing became clear. The project that began with 14 wolves in Yellowstone, with Edward O. Wilson standing in Amazon smoke, with 15 countries making a pledge at the United Nations, had become something far greater than conservation. It had become the conscious evolution of a species that finally understood its place in the community of life. Homo sapiens, the wise ape, had grown into its name at last. The future was wild, and it was wonderful.